Okay, this is the Unit 4 test review. So the main idea about this whole unit is you're solving equations, and they're quadratic, okay? So one of the skills you have to know is you need to know how to simplify a radical. So for instance, on this one here, if I break this down, and I breaks it down to 7 and 7. So the square root, because there's only two of them, the square root of 49 is 7. So on this one, my answer would end up being 7. But because of that negative there, it would be 7i. Okay, on this one here, you can break it down again. So I've got 9 and 8, and then I have 3 and 3, but I also have 2 and 4, and 4 can break down to 2 and 2. So the main thing that I'm doing here is I'm looking for pairs. So there's a pair and there's a pair. So if I just take one number from each of those pairs and multiply them, so that's 2 times 3 is 6. And then the only thing I have left over is that 2, so 6 times the square root of 2. Now, one way that you can always check these answers is if I type in the square root of 72, I get that. And then if I type in 6 times the square root of 2, which is what it's simplified to, you should get the exact same thing. Okay, on the next ones here, we're just doing factoring. So the main thing with factoring is you really got to make sure you look for that GCF first, okay? Once you find that GCF, then you can find out what other kind of factoring you have to do. So for instance, on this one, I can factor out a 4, so this becomes 4, and on the inside I have x squared plus 5x plus 6. And then I notice that I really don't need to use the box here, so this will actually break down to x plus 2 and x plus 3. And then you can't forget the 4. Now, this is a special kind of factoring. These are difference of squares. And the reason I know it's difference of squares is because there's not a b term, and also because these are both perfect squares. So in order to do this one, I take the square root of both sides, and then I'm going to have one that's going to be a plus, and I'm running out of room, so I'm going to write it on the bottom, and one that's going to be a minus. So the square root of 9x squared is 3x, and the square root of 49 is 7. So I'm going to have 3x plus 7 and 3x minus 7. Okay, on the last one over here, again, I can notice that my a is 1, so I really don't need to do a box. So if I just find out what two numbers multiply to get negative 6 and combine to get negative 1, I could tell it's going to be 2 and 3. But that's going to be a negative 3. So here, I'm going to have x minus 3, and I'm also going to have x plus 2. Okay, now down here is where they want you to factor it, and then they want you to find the roots. So for this first one, again, what I'm going to notice is that there is a greatest common factor. So if I take out the 3, I'm left with x squared minus 5x plus 6. And then I need to find out what two numbers will multiply to get 6 and combine to get negative 3. Now, they both can be manipulated to get a 5, but remember, it has to multiply to get positive 6 and combine to get negative 5. So that means it's going to be these two, because they're both going to be negative. So my factors will be x minus 2 and x minus 3, but my roots will be x equals 2, x equals 3. Okay, so on number 17, if I were to do this one, what I'm going to notice is that there's no greatest common factor, and I'm also going to notice I have to use the box because that's a 4. So I'm going to multiply that, and I get negative 12. So I'm trying to figure out what two numbers multiply to get negative 12 and combine to get negative 11. So that will be 1 and negative 12. So over here, if I come into the box, I'm going to have 4x squared, and I'm going to have a negative 3, and a 1x, and a negative 12x. Okay, so remember, my x's always go in the corner. Now I need a 4x here. So I can't pull the 4 out here because the greatest common factor of 1 and 4 is not 4. But I can put the 4 up here because the greatest common factor of 12 and 4 is 4. Okay, so now I'm just going to start building the rest of my factors. So x times what gives me 1x? 1. So one of my factors is 4x plus 1. And then I notice that If I do 4 times negative 3, that'll give me negative 12x. So my other factor is x minus 3. Now my roots, or zeros, or solutions, or x-intercepts, whatever you want to call them, are x equals negative 1 over 4 and x equals 3. Okay, down here is where they want you to do the quadratic formula and then decide on what kind of answer it is. So the main thing here is that it needs to equal 0. So you'll notice that all of these are all ready to be set up, equals 0, equals 0, equals 0, okay? But these down here do not equal 0. So let's do number 23. So if I subtract all of that over, here's what I'm left with. So that's 8x squared minus 6x plus 1 equals 0. Now 8 is my A, this is my B, and this is my C. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start putting it into the quadratic formula. Okay, so here I go. So here I'm going to have x equals, I got the negative. Now this B is also negative, so it's going to turn into a positive. I forgot the plus or minus up there. Okay, and then plus or minus negative 6 squared, make sure that negative 6 is in parentheses, squared, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A, which is 8. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this part in my calculator. And I get 4. So here, I'm going to continue it over here. So x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 4 over 16. Now, I can tell that this is going to be our 2 rational solutions because of the square root of 4. Because the square root of 4 is 2. And then if I just start working that out, negative 6 minus 2 is negative 8. Over 16, which gives me negative 1/2, so that's a rational number. The other thing here is I have negative 6 plus 2, which is negative 4, over 16, which is negative 1/4. So those are my 2 answers, negative 1/4 and negative 1/2. Okay, on the back. Oh, let me mention this. On these problems here, if you ever get a negative inside of this number, so this is called a discriminant. So if you ever get a negative, so say it looks something like that, remember, you have to have an I on the outside. You have to have that I. Okay, on this side here is we're just solving by completing the square, so I'll just do one of these. So the main thing here is you have to create your own C value. So for instance, on this one, let me subtract the 18x over, because we already did these 2 in class. Okay, so here, you would have x squared minus 18x blank equals 40 blank, okay? Now, to create that number in here, I'm going to do b divided by 2 squared. So if I do that, that's going to be negative 18 divided by 2 squared, which gives me negative 9 squared, and that gives you 81. So plus 81 plus 81. So down here what I now have is I have x minus 9 squared, because what happens in the parentheses stays in the parentheses, equals 121. Well, to get rid of that squared, I do the square root. So that gives me x minus 9 equals plus or minus 11. So plus 9 plus 9. So I got 2 problems going on here. I have x equals 20 because of the positive 11 and the positive 9. I also have x equals negative 2 because of the negative 11 and the positive 9. Okay, on this one down here, so on 32, this is really just pure calculator. So if I type that equation in, first of all, I need to make sure I have a 0 here in y2. Okay, so then all I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to graph it. So this is just the word problem. I'm trying to figure out where it hits the ground. So the ground is considered the x-axis, and that's where y equals 0. So I don't see the graph, so I'm going to zoom out. And there I see it. So I'm going to hit second, trace, intersect, and then I'm going to hit enter, 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 and there's my answer, 17.48. That's how long it'll take. Now this one, first of all, I can tell this is going to be a minimum just because it opens, it has a positive number right there, a positive 1. So I know this will have a minimum. Now, to find the vertex, remember, all you do is you just type it in. So I would do x squared plus 12x plus 29. And if I go to my table, you can always look for that repeating pattern. So there it is. So the vertex here is -6 and -7. So again, down here it has to equal 0. So before I could even do this one, I would need to add or subtract everything to the other side. And then once it equals 0, what I can do is okay, and then make sure you have that 0 in there. And if I do second, trace, intersect, enter, enter, enter. So one of the answers is x equals 5. And then I'm going to do the second trace intersect again. But remember, you got to move the cursor to the other side. So it's on the other side now. And enter, enter, enter. And I get x equals -8. So you can always use the calculator for these. Now this one here is a little bit more difficult. First of all, change that number to x plus 3. So on this one, what you could do is, it may be easier to look at it like a rectangle. So if I do that, I would need to double that. I would double the area to 70 feet squared. Okay, now remember, to find area, you do area equals length times width. So I know the area is 70, and I know that I have a length and a width. So I'm multiplying those two. Now, those parentheses tell me I need to distribute. So 70 equals x squared plus 3x. I also know it has to equal 0, so minus 70 minus 70. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm just trying to figure out what two numbers will multiply to get -70 and combine to get 3. Well, 10 and 7, but the 7 would have to be negative. So here what I have is, I have x plus 10, and I have x minus 7. So the x equals -10, and the x equals 7. Now, I don't want the -10 because you can't have a negative length. So here, x would be 7. And there you have it. Okay, let me go back and do one of these. It's already kind of similar to what we did up here with completing the square. So for instance, if I do this one here, just remember you got to take the square root of both sides. And once you do that, that leaves it, which is x minus 1. Now the part that's easy to forget is right there. Remember, that has to equal a positive 1 or a negative 1. So if I add 1 here, I'm going to have x equals 2 because of the positive 1 and positive 1. And I'm also going to have x equals 0 because of the negative 1 and the positive 1. Okay, if you need any additional help, make sure you ask your teacher. If you're my student, Remind 101, get a hold of me. All right, that's it.